Hello, everyone, and welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. I'm Rob, and today we're joined by my friend Jessica Otey. Jessica has a PhD in Italian. She currently works at University of Virginia, not in a language sense. And recently, we went through the Gospel of Mark together. Jessica had never read a book of the Bible, book of the New Testament before, and she actually approached me after becoming friends and just asked if I would be interested in doing a Bible study. And I really thought Gospel Mark is just a good intro to the Bible and into Jesus's life, being a Greco-Roman biography. And today we're just going to have a little chat about it. So, Jessica, welcome to Church Coffee.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me. This is gonna be wild.
Wylan, Wylan. So, obviously, first and foremost, what's your favorite coffee? Caffeinated beverage, hot or cold? If you're not a caffeine person, what's your routine in the morning to wake up?
So I like coffee, but coffee doesn't like me. So I've been decaf only for a couple years now, which is
What's your
fine.
go-to decaf?
I have a Nespresso machine where it makes a little foam, but my favorite is to have those super fancy European machines that make the milk and the coffee. So like a cappuccino from one of those. That's my go-to. They have them all over Europe, but in America they'll have them at the like airport lounges. That's my favorite thing about the airport lounge.
Mm, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I follow like Coffee Some on or whatever the equivalent of Coffee Some is on YouTube, and he actually said the mark of a really great roaster is the ability to make a really tasty decaf coffee. So good thing to find.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's I every time I go to Europe though, I get re-addicted to caffeine. So,
drug
because
of choice, most abused drug in the world.
yes, exactly. And the drug that everyone is on, and when you're not on it, you're like, what's wrong with me?
So give us your story. I gave a little intro there, and then also maybe weave in your religious or non-religious background.
So I'm Jewish and I grew up feeling Jewish in like two senses. One, my Judaism was really cultural. We didn't really go to temple. I was not bat mitzvahed. And it occurred to me later in life that like, because I'm the oldest of my cousins on my mother's side, and my mother is the one who's Jewish. And so it occurred to me like kind of after the fact, it's like, wait, wasn't I supposed to get a bat mitzvah? But it was like, oh well. It was it was weird that it only really occurred to me after the fact. The famous story my mother tells about this is that my best friend as a kid lived across the street from me, and she apparently asked once when we were really little, and they're both in the back of the car. And Elizabeth asks, do you go to church? And I said, no, we're Jewish. We have potlucks. Because my entire understanding of Judaism was as a sort of home-based religion. And my other sense of being religious was that like my understanding of Christianity was very partial and removed. It was sort of like my only understanding of Christianity was overt, kind of even aggressive proselytizing. I used to joke that I
And
was the only four-year old who knew the word proselytize.
and is that because of where you grew up? Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and maybe that atmosphere as
I
well?
grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically Oakland. So yeah, it's like you could walk to the supermarket and there would be people, telling you, like with some varying degrees of ferventness that you needed to like, get saved or, asking you, approaching you. There was a lot of like it was a very it was an area full of people who wanted to, change the world, do the right thing, whatever their sort of mission was. There were a lot of people who had a lot of strong ideas and wanted to share them, which is a great thing. But it led to, because I was the only Jewish kid on my block, it really led to this feeling that like, which is totally false in the context of the Bay Area, and I know that now. But it really felt like I was like this really tiny minority in this big Christian sea. And as I grew older, I began to like, first of all, appreciate that the Bay Area is full of Jews, and also just appreciate the kind of like there was actually a lot of grace. Like I felt really proud of America for being able to be what I considered sort of a Christian place, but because it was full of Christian people, but like really take seriously this idea that um just because that was the dominant religion didn't mean that was the identity of the country. So I actually felt really good about that. And I still feel really good about the way that, we're really fortunate in America to have freedom of religious worship here. We take it for granted, but we shouldn't, because it's really special.
And I also mentioned in the intro your academic background. Why don't you give us a little bit of
Right.
that and what you're
So,
currently ish doing?
so I have a PhD in Italian studies, and I came to Italian because I love languages. Italian is a beautiful language. I love opera. Opera was is there's a lot of great Italian opera. So I spent a year in Italy when I was, in college, and you go to a lot of churches when you live in Italy. And so I had to sort of negotiate that because I'd never really been exposed to any of that. I'd never really been to a lot of churches, and there's churches everywhere in Italy. So it was fine. I think you just come to sort of like have I wouldn't say you have an understanding, but you have you have appreciation, and you just lose some of your. I lost a lot of my discomfort just through, I guess you could call it a form of exposure therapy. Like, and churches are beautiful places, and they still to this day like hold, exemplar beautiful art, and it's so. And I dropped out of academia about like I guess like 4 or 5 years after getting my PhD, and I have a tech career now, which is, I mean, not my first love, but it pays the bills.
We will pause for a sponsor break from Handy Mike and Genesis Contracting. Handy Mike and Genesis are a locally owned and family operated handyman and contractor company serving the greater Charlottesville area since 2016. They are a Class A licensed, bonded, and insured contractor with over 60 years of knowledge. Their teams of skilled, reliable, and trustworthy technicians have been handpicked in order to provide our customers with outstanding service across a broad range of tradesman skills. Handy Mike can do all of your home maintenance repairs and small projects, from changing a light bulb to deck repairs to electrical and plumbing fixtures, and so much more. Genesis Contracting can handle larger jobs, including bathroom and kitchen renovations, remodels, and additions. If you're looking for a team to help make your dreams a reality and bring your concept to creation, call them today for a free estimate. 434 422 6000. You can also find more of their information in the show notes. Now, back to the show.
And you've kind of already somewhat mentioned on your general knowledge of Christianity, but why don't you go a little bit expand on that? Before we started doing our Bible study, what was your general knowledge of Christianity, New Testament in general? Maybe what did you think about what was your general understanding of Jesus? Give us a little bit round robin of that.
I mean, I had an internship my first year of college, and one of the women who worked where I was interning, she was this I think her family was probably Jamaican, but she'd grown up in London, and she was this very fervent born again Christian, and she basically told me straight out that I was going to burn in hell unless I accepted Jesus Christ as my savior. And so like obviously that's only one example, but let's just say that played an outsized role in my imagination. I was a bit of a sheltered young person. And even though I had like lived in Europe for a year, it was very, I don't know, it felt very, I feel like that in a way stood in, like, unfairly, admittedly, like stood in for my understanding of what it meant to believe or not believe. Like there was this very firm line between those two types of experiences. And if you weren't on one side, there were consequences. And I think what really changed for me was I never like one of the reasons I wanted to read with you and Val was because I'd never explored the Bible in the context of people who actually lived a Christian life. And so that was for me a way of sort of dissolving that barrier because like we knew each other, we were friends. Obviously we got to know each other better, but it's like the text doesn't draw that line because we're in the same room, we live in the same city, we're exploring it together. Like that whole sort of idea of, sign your name on the line. I think that was my understanding of Christianity, especially as it relates to Jesus. Jesus was the sort of maybe you could say like to extend this metaphor, the notary Like that was how you knew somebody was sort of like in the club or not in the club. I didn't really, I feel like my notion about Jesus was completely politicized from like the way that our politics in this country has been for a long time. And I started as I feel like my openness to sort of what Christianity could be separate of politics really only really opened for me when I started to feel um, sort of cast out from my own political tribe. So I'm like the, classic, well, classic. I mean, I know a lot of disaffected Democrats, maybe a lot of, undisaffected Democrats don't know any, but I know a lot of them. And I feel like that same, I sort of began to, I think what happened was I began to realize that in the same way that I felt that Jesus was used as sort of a like with us or against us kind of tool for identifying who's on which side, I started to see liberal politics do that too. And I was like, oh, well, maybe it's not that simple. Maybe that's just the sort of, a very narrow sliver of what the whole thing really is about. So that sort of made me want to learn more, experience it from a position that wasn't sort of like my way or the highway, but what it's really about. Like ask people who actually believe, ask people actually who are reasonable, who aren't making just bold statements like, you're gonna go to hell.
While I do believe that, I try not to lead with that.
You're so clever.
Not hard. Or maybe it is. So before studying Mark, what was your kind of idea of Jesus's story? I assume growing up in a Christian-esque nation or at least a Christian-influenced culture, you knew of Jesus being born on December 25th and being crucified around Easter. But what were some other markers of his story that somewhat were just floating around in your mind before we started studying?
I mean, I think in the secular zeitgeist that I grew up in, it was this Jesus was a good person kind of attitude. It was just the sort of take the religion out of it. And, it was, I guess you could say, like to update the characterization. Like when my childhood would have been like Jesus was a hippie who wanted everyone to be nice and get along. And now that would be updated to like, Jesus was a social justice warrior. But I mean, I feel like in fact the framework of Jesus as a sort of 60s hippie was more salient than I don't really think that I in some ways I feel like that was I feel like people growing up now in the environment in which I grew up might even know less about Jesus in the New Testament because religion has become so politicized. But
Yeah, you'll I've seen quite often that Jesus was a feminist. What does that even mean? Or Jesus was a socialist. Do people know what that might mean in drawing to Jesus? It almost feels like almost everyone wants to kind of paint Jesus with their own brush without trying to deal with nuance and some of the harder aspects of his biography.
right, and I think I had an understanding that I understood that Jesus was a Jew and that the context that he lived in was a Jewish context, and that the main difference between Judaism and Christianity was that Jesus is the Messiah for Christians and not for Jews. But like I had a very, very bare minimum of like real depth knowledge about what that would mean, why that like what even really early Judaism was like. I mean, I knew about the temple. I knew the very, very, very basics, but I mean, I think there's that sort of like the two sides. Like you can appreciate who Jesus was, you can appreciate what he stood for, but then there's the believer burn in hell thing on the other side. And like one of those things is obviously much more approachable than the other. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'd given it that much thought. I mean, I didn't have a religious education in my own supposed, religious inheritance either. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I did obviously read like texts that are religious adjacent. I mean, I studied the Divine Comedy as an Italianist, but
For non-Italianist, what is the Divine Comedy?
the Divine Comedy is a three-part. It's it's written in it's poetic, but it's like this poetic exploration of where Dante, goes on this visit to hell, purgatory, and heaven, and it's about what that means. But of course, it's all very, um, it's all really related to his, 14th century, life.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's just, but yeah. And that's the thing I think about my upbringing is I was totally able to take that on board as literature without needing to take, you don't have to be a believer to read a text like that and get a lot out of it. I'm
Yeah.
sure believers get other things out of it, but you know, there's that
Mhm.
whole literary angle. I guess you could say that I could appreciate the Bible as literature, which is, I think, a standard secular kind of position to have.
Yeah. What were some details? I mean, Mark is it's often called the abridged gospel or the smaller gospel. It is roughly 16 chapters, whereas every other gospel is 20-ish or even more. But what were some of the details of Jesus's life that surprised you, struck you, have stuck with you that you just didn't know about or really were just kind of like, whoa, this happened? This happened? Just give us a,
So
smattering of stuff that comes to mind.
I think one of the things that most surprised me about Mark was that the birth story isn't in all the gospels. Like how that's like totally not where it begins. That surprised me. I think the other thing that's really surprised me was how sort of dense and kind of silly the apostles are a lot. Like it's not a story about, it's not a sort of happy path story. I mean, it is in some ways, but like in Mark, especially without the sort of additional ending, that whole thing, it really is like it's a piece of the story. This because the story is being lived in the ears and mouths of the people who are reading and hearing that text. So I think I was just really surprised by the context, like the overall way that the stories fit as religious text. Like I was totally ignorant about like what it would be like to sort of hear those stories, like um hear the details that hear this sort of story that Mark tells, which is basically like, you know, the preview of Jesus through John the Baptist up until, his being discovered missing from the tomb. Like those two bookends were definitely not my sort of traditional understanding um of Christian worship or Christian, like I didn't, like if you had asked me, I think I would have come up with more with this sort of Christmas Easter, but there is no Christmas Easter in in Mark. It doesn't work like that
Well,
because
there's sort of an Easter, right?
there's kind of an Easter, but it's like an implied Easter.
Yeah,
It's subtext more than text.
yeah.
Um,
For a lot of people who don't maybe not are super familiar with Mark and then just do a 2-year study on it. Mark intros with John the Baptist, a very short intro, and Mark exerludes with women finding the tomb, and what Christian scholars to secular academics very much consensus on that Mark ends at chapter 16, verse 8, whereas there's this additional longer ending, depending on how you look at it, one extra verse, 10 extra verses that kind of have an extra add-on because the original ending of Mark that we largely think is how it ended ends very abruptly. It's like the women find and then just run away and then that's it. And most scholars think that that these additional endings were tacked on just as a kind of like explanation factor. And there's a lot of like interplay between other gospels and maybe even a Pauline epistle that just kind of gets summarized in there. But the fact that Jesus' story is bookended by people that aren't super related, John the Baptist being probably a cousin of Jesus, and the women being his followers, but just these kind of abrupt starts and stops.
I mean, I really love that ending because I feel like that ending is so, I don't know. I really, there's a lot of things I love about Mark, and one of them is that ending, that it's like, it's a text so inside of its context that we are obviously, because Christianity has shaped the Western world so significantly, we live in, to a certain degree, in the context of that text, because that text created the context that we know as the West. But if you like play a little mind game with yourself and you imagine being a participant in the specific context where that text was written and read, it it changes, it changed the way, at least for me personally, it changed the way, a lot of the way that I think about Christianity, and I think about um, what those early Christians were thinking about when they thought about Jesus. Like that definitely had an effect on me. Just how I mean, I was listening to last night, I was listening to David Suchet. He's done like an entire reading of the Bible. And you can just pull it up on YouTube. And he's a great voice, obviously, right? Because he's an actor. And I was listening to him read Mark. And what he does is he just reads the chapter, like he's just like chapter one. And then he'll read the whole chapter, and you won't obviously hear any of the verse numbers, right? And then he'll have like a big, like a nice, generous pause before the next chapter. And when you hear those, when you take the story in as these little kind of like vignettes, which is what they become when you're hearing them like that, you're like, wow, this is wild. And like they just keep getting, there's just sort of this like the way that Mark is able to relate these sort of events of incredible significance with almost sort of like an anti-dramatic kind of way of narrating, and like, and then this, and then this. It's I there's a magic to that. It's like it's understated, but at the same time incredibly immediate at the same time. It's very powerful. Like the way that it's constructed is very powerful, and that that was one of the things I appreciated about reading the text in the way we did, was that it's not just slogans. It's not just like, accept Jesus as your personal savior. It's not the sort of political, social, it's not modern in that sense. It's not about like where you stand in relation to it. It's the story. It's the story. And I really appreciated that a lot.
We did a pericope study, that is Koine Greek for paragraph, where we went more or less paragraph by paragraph or section by section. Modern Bibles obviously have chapter, verse, and even section titles. Those are obviously nowhere in the original manuscripts. So like every now and then someone will ask me or tell me, or I'll see like, show me chapter and verse where this happened, where Jesus said this in the Bible. Kind of like, that's not how it's supposed to be read. Like you're actually supposed to read the whole thing. Chapters were actually pretty early, both in the Old and New Testament, pretty added early on, but they were added so inconsistently that just kind of like monks are just kind of breaking up different points. Our chapter and verses actually come from just a Parisian printer who just kind of broke up the text how he saw it. There's nothing really religious about it. But my next question is you've talked about already how it's kind of impacted your thinking. Is there anything personal about your life that in reflecting on Jesus's story, whether it's a parable or a scene or even just maybe some pithy teaching, has really impacted your maybe not your faith, since you don't subscribe to Judaism or Christianity, but impacted your way of living or anything along those lines?
I think I have a much greater appreciation of how much harder it is to live a life based on virtues, faith, ideals, all those things. I definitely am more interested in the sort of bigger questions, like especially that scene at the beginning where, like, I think Mark says, like, the entire, he's, John the Baptist is baptizing people, and some sort of phrase like, everyone came out from the town. And part of me is like, does he really mean everyone? Like, is this like some of the, like, is that sort of a poetic exaggeration, or is that sort of an expression of like a true sort of moment in time where everybody was searching, was going to, you know everybody's growing up, everybody's living in this communal religious context, and is everyone really going to go and do this other thing? Like, is this a new movement? Like the whole kind of, I think I don't think there's ever been a time in my life where the bigger questions of like what does it mean for humans to be redeemable like by a creator, like these bigger questions of like redemption, what is, what was man created for, like I feel like those questions have become much more relevant to me personally. Like I guess what you could sort of say is I've lost the like all of the sort of like scales of politicized religion have fallen away, mostly just through the fact that like I have friends who are believers, and it's recontextualized that for me, and also because I've had experience of political disillusionment, I now feel more comfortable being like, oh, yeah, these big questions do matter to me. I've been reading this really interesting book about Exodus, which is the woman writing it is she's actually doing it's about the Torah, but it's about midrash, which is I like to describe as biblical fan fiction, but like obviously like on a very scholarly level. But these scholars would go and like basically expand the stories and like imagine other details of the story to explain um parts of the Torah that was like, why is it like this? And I feel like asking those big questions has never made more sense to me. Like I feel like I maybe that's just age. I don't know, but definitely feel much more like able to sort of approach those bigger questions about like what does it mean for a community to all go leave their house and go get baptized in a river by somebody new. Like take that, I guess to me, like take it seriously. Like what does it mean to worry about, as a community, the idea that we need to be redeemed? Like that is a notion I now take completely seriously, whereas I did not before.
It's awesome. Thank you for that. Noted before, you're in a PhD level literary critic on some level. What do you make? And you've already mentioned how much you really like the structure of Mark. What, in a literary academic sense, what do you just make of the structure of Mark? Do you think this is a hastily constructed book? Do you think this was something that was obviously thought out, or even to the Christian uh, inspired by the Holy Spirit? In what ways do you see just a kind of structure to Mark in a purely academic literary critic type of way?
I mean, I don't think I would actually know enough to say. I mean, any of my impressions, like I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm sort of making a half-hearted attempt to like learn to read it in Greek, but I remember when we did the pericope about Herod and how like he gets sort of rock and a hard placed into killing John the Baptist, and how I had like so much sympathy for him because it's like he has all the tools that he needs to be a virtuous person, but he can't quite muster it. I mean, I don't really have any like PhD level thoughts, but I sort of feel like I do get the impression that the text of Mark was supposed to be understood in this way where there were no punches pulled, in the sense that like it is very down to earth. It's not trying to make anything that's it's not trying to downplay the miraculous, but it's also not trying to like upsell the easiness either, in the sense that human the sort of it's actually really interesting to think about how many human shortcomings are on display constantly in the text, and how that sort of
Especially among the disciples, right?
right, the supposed people who are going to like you know become the sort of venerated, fast forward 2000 years, those are the like most venerated, you know um like the church fathers. I guess it's more of a Catholic view, but this idea that this institution, I think that's what it is. It's this sort of fundamentally anti-institutionalist view. I think, with kings that can't make basic decisions. I mean, because like that whole Herod thing is like, because the Old Testament goes on and on and on about how you shouldn't swear oaths. You shouldn't like, there's all these disastrous stories of of like people saying, I'll sacrifice the first thing I see. And it's like your daughter. Was that Jephthah or something? That story was told in Dante, which is why I know it so well. But like, so, here's this king who can't figure his own heritage long enough to sort of just like make a basic, prudent, you know, decision. And basically ends up doing something he knows to be wrong. And how, yeah, it's almost like, it's like, obviously I know the context in which Mark would have been written and uttered. And these were obviously people who believed in, the significance of the world changing significance of Jesus's resurrection. Like, I understand that intellectually, but one of the things I actually appreciated about the text in leaving that off is, in this gospel anyway, was this idea that it begins with something that's missing, right? The women don't find Jesus there. Just like in the beginning, there's something missing that drives them all out of their house to go to the river. So that, like, I can definitely appreciate that Jesus is the understood answer for believers to that. But like, to come to it from a position of, not having like a specific, I mean, I would never call myself an atheist, because to be an atheist is just to be religious with no casseroles and no potlucks. I would say that I'm like a reluctant agnostic or a confused agnostic. I mean, I'm not really like, I don't doubt that there is like a actual knowable moral good, like how, like, reading C.S. Lewis, he makes the case that if you know what is good, then that must mean that there's an awareness of something that comes. Where does the good come from, right? And I'm pretty persuaded by that, because I believe in natural law, I suppose you could say, or natural good, and that must come from somewhere. Um, but I think what I love about the way that Mark does that structurally, where is the idea that he lets people who read it come at it as a question where maybe the answer isn't there for you yet. Like, this is the possibility. Because I mean, it's isn't it kind of weird to think that there's so many people who like would have come into contact with Jesus who didn't become believers? I mean, so like that exists.
I mean, the one of the longest discourses in Mark is the parable of the sower. Like, before even studying it with you, I had not realized that Jesus has very short sayings in Mark, and generally throughout the rest of the Synoptic Gospels. But in Mark, his longest, next to the Olivet discourse, is him talking about parable of the sower, which of course is kind of setting up that only a few people are going to actually be few believers, right? Like 3 of the 4-ish, maybe. There's some debate on at least one of them. But certainly half will fall away, a quarter will be believers-ish, and then only 1/4 falls on ground that actually is able to produce seeds. So already in his time, I mean, he says after coming down from the ascension, I'm sorry, not the ascension, when he goes up on the mountain and he meets Elijah and Moses, and that part in Mark.
Yeah, I remember that part barely.
Yeah, right before that, Peter is asking him, is he the Messiah? And he goes, yes, but this is going to be hard. This is going to be so hard. Like, at one point he says, you're going to have to pick up your cross every day and follow me, which I've even written a short opinion piece on why that was shocking then. It's kind of lost its relevance now. Like, that's kind of like Jesus saying to an American, you're going to have to bring a hangman's noose with you everywhere you go, because you have to be ready to get killed, get murdered for what I am teaching you, which is, it's a blessing to live in a place where we can practice religious freedom like that, as you've pointed out. But that was not the case for Mark's church, which probably would have been the primary audience for this in Rome, or even later in Alexandria. But yeah, hard times that Christians these days have to deal with, but not so much in America or the West and developed countries generally-ish. You've remarked on the Jewishness of Jesus. And were there some parts of Jesus's Jewish story that stuck out to you in being, wow, he's Jewish?
I think what stuck out to me was the fact that like the religious polarization of that period was entirely within Judaism. Like just learning about all the different sort of, and I think this is something that The Chosen actually does really well in like showing the different sects and how political it all is and how much it's wrapped up in contemporary politics. But the thing is, though, when you're dealing with a text that old, like modern Judaism has nothing in common with any of the Jewishness represented in that time period. So yeah, Jesus was a Jew, but like all of those Jews were not like, because I mean the destruction of the temple, the second destruction of the temple was really the point of view where anything that is even remotely recognizable as modern Judaism like takes its origin point from. And even then, I mean, we're still like, many, many, many hundreds of years prior to like what you would recognize as, contemporary Jewish practice. Um, but I mean, I think it's safe to say that um, I think what struck me a lot about it is that how much connection there is between the Gospels and the Old Testament. That the people who are writing and who people who are understanding Jesus are understanding him from a tradition that um, you know like obviously he is their contemporary in that sense that talking about their own time, but the text that they reference, like Isaiah, like there's a completely natural historical continuity for them. And I think that was very surprising. And I think on that level, it does feel very Jewish to me that they treat the same texts that Jews think are, special and sacred, that those texts were appreciated by the gospel writers in the same way. So I definitely feel that connection.
Before we get to our next question, you already anticipated an extra question of mine. Continue. We had so much fun and good camaraderie during the Bible study. We've actually started watching The Chosen together. What low-ish budget show, but what has like surprised you? What is like um felt that the that show has done really well so far? We've just started season 3, so that's
Yeah, no
important to the people.
spoilers. I guess we could. Yeah, no, I really like the way that the sort of I really like the way that the sort of intricacies of Jewish belief are being represented in that context and how there was already a sort of, I guess there always is in a very organized religious society that's, already sort of, has that city country kind of, population mix and how, there's already a religious elite. And I think, I mean, I guess the sort of, more obvious parallel would have been, what the Catholic Church became in the Middle Ages. But I really like that, although I can see how like those representations really do potentially lend themselves to everybody seeing like Jesus as this one particular person and all the Jews conspiring against him with the Romans. Like I sense that as sort of like this odd kind of, I mean, danger might be too far of a word, but like I don't know. Like I think it's difficult to present because I mean Jesus obviously was someone who was you know he was an outsider. He was a rebel in some very meaningful religious and political sense. There wasn't this idea in Judaism that you know a personal representative of God could come and do things like expiate sin. That didn't exist. I mean, certainly the concept of the Messiah existed, but it wasn't. I mean, from the little I know about it, it seems like, and this is what the apostles are confused about, right? I mean, they expect him to be an earthly king. And so, I mean, yeah, I think The Chosen is really good for how it faithfully attempts to, describe a Jewish milieu at that time. Yeah, I wonder sometimes if certain people might look at that and say, oh, and like abstract, make a larger, you know, anti-Semitic argument, which, I mean, if you just look at like the Catholicism of like a century ago, was still incredibly anti-Semitic. Like I've been reading up or listening to people talk about like the way that the papacy thought about like its own sort of political role and influence in the world, and how they were convinced that there was this sort of conspiracy between the Jews, the Protestants, and the Masons, or just like how, I mean, so obviously churches and these hierarchies don't like, things change. Like a church is an institution like any other, right? And so I sort of feel like the safest way is to sort of look at that time of Judaism, just the way we look at any institution that's vulnerable to like corruption, infighting, you know, terrible deeds. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know what people who aren't Jewish would look at the Chosen and feel about that period of Judaism. I have no context for that. That's actually an interesting question.
Yeah, I've actually so it's been bookmarked in the back of my mind too. I'm a bronze subscriber to Bart Ehrman's blog, so I can ask him just like a few questions a week. But I actually wondered if he's seen any of it and what his critique would be from a purely historical academic standpoint, because from a very minor look at it, I'm constantly surprised at how much stuff they get right. I mean, they film in rural Texas, so every now and then it's like, oh well, this tree wouldn't be there. Well, yeah, they're not going to film in historical Palestine right now or anything like that. So, so our final question. Hopefully, this will be a fun one. Now that you've studied Mark, and I know you've actually read more of the Bible, in what ways do you see Jesus as being misrepresented, both from a conservative Christian point of view, but also maybe secular liberals, or even what pejoratively, I think, which is overstated sometimes, what liberal Christians might feel. And just in general, what ways do you think Jesus is misrepresented? Carte blanche, but maybe point out what ways you might think conservatives versus liberals misrepresent Jesus in your opinion.
I mean, I think I would say that, for the liberal side, the critique is pretty easy. Like the liberal critique is like, well, Jesus just wants you to do whatever you want that makes you happy. That's clearly not true. I mean, um, if anything, Jesus seems to be a little bit mystified why, or maybe like not surprised, but still a little bit indignant about how his like the sort of constant, you know, like jockeying for position or, desire for favor that among the disciples. So clearly, like the way of Jesus is not like do whatever and it's fine. So like a sort of liberal, like any sort of idea that like, I think Tom Holland is calling his next book "All You Need Is Love," like after the Beatles lyric. Like in a secular understanding of that, of that statement, that is not sufficient to describe what Jesus is really asking. Because I think I have a much better appreciation for the sense that while of course, we should take seriously, the admonitions about like how we treat each other, Sermon on the Mount style, like social arrangements. I think it's too easy from the liberal position to lose you lose the essential question about redemption, about what it means to like come to the point, like if you can think of the Old Testament as sort of, or at least the Torah as, this question of can man be redeemed, right? Is the human creation redeemable in the eyes of its creator? Then, Jesus, especially like we talked a lot about this, how the Last Supper is like, so because I've been going to Catholic Mass and just to have them repeat, just to see them repeat the Passover, because that's what the Eucharist is, right? It's a little mini enactment of the Last Supper, which was the Passover. And so every time they do that, they're basically saying, the idea is the symbolic meaning of that is, we're no longer focused on our history of coming out of Egypt. We're no longer, excuse me, like the focus isn't that sort of initial step from Egypt to Sinai, where you're released from your slave master to become the servants of God. Now there's this further journey, right? And we talk about how like the last cup of wine is, saved and or not, how like the idea it's supposed to basically be this turning point in history. And I think even if we just leave aside the Catholic context, because I know you're not Catholic, but like even without that sort of like immediate repeating
We're friendly to Catholics here on Church Coffee.
exactly. So, but even if you leave out that specific emphasis on the Eucharist, I think I have a much better understanding now about like it isn't just about smile and be nice and in love everybody. It's a much deeper level of about, redemption and like what it means, like both socially and spiritually, to have a better understanding of what sin is and how to turn away from it. So that would be the easy critique from the liberal side. From the conservative side, I guess I would say that my favorite example here is the prodigal son. Because you and I listen to probably some of the same quote unquote heterodox media, whatever. But I definitely believe that there is a religious revival in this country, that people like me are going to turn to Christianity because it's there. And there is a certain aspect of our society that I think, at least, I mean, this is speaking from my personal vantage point, that is really has an attitude of any port in a storm. And things are changing in a way that a lot of people are very suddenly uncomfortable about.
Yeah, I think that's both right and left, or from the political right and political left, and cultural right and cultural left. But yeah, I think Tom Holland's done a lot of good work on that. Is not only on his podcast that he sprinkles throughout, but certainly on his work Dominion, for all of his um, maybe or maybe not problematic cultural critiques. I think Jordan Peterson has done a lot of good work on presenting why the Bible is so historically and culturally important to the West. Yeah, and I'd certainly see that both in my own life and in our friendship, and just in general, people are kind of like fed up with the new atheist movement. I want to give my morality some sort of base. I'm not a nun. A nun meaning that someone may or may not be agnostic or atheist, but they just answer, I'm not really religious at all, or those type of spiritual but not religious people seem to just wanting some more traction to their life's purpose. And honestly, with the breakdown, I think honestly with not the breakdown of society, but the breakdown of communal culture in general, like millennials are now job jumping all over the place, and you're getting less community from your job, or maybe you're still at your same job and you are moved totally online, but that you're missing that one-on-one, that actual physical space. Yes, you can have friends from League of Legends, but at the same time, is that really gonna be the same as someone that you take communion with every week, that you study the Bible with every week, that you call when your marriage is falling apart, or that your parent just died? Like, are you really going to turn to your work associate for that, or do you want to have some sort of intentional community? Someone else I wanted to mention, Jonathan Haidt, I think has done a lot of good work in that space. He's more moved now towards cultural critiques, but Righteous Mind would be a good book for that. He himself has said, I'm an atheist, I'm an atheist Jew, but he attends a conservative Jewish synagogue every week because he thinks that's an important enrichment for his child's life.
Right. And so I think that the people who have long been Christians and long been believers are going to really have to lean on that prodigal son parable or story, because it is going to be difficult to accept a lot of people who formerly, didn't see the value in religion or religious community, and may have like sort of, I mean, I don't see myself ever becoming, in the sense like I don't see myself becoming a single issue voter against abortion. I mean, even if my personal sentiments may evolve on that issue, my sentiment about the legality of, I just not the type of person who's ever going to be like, I want to make laws that express my personal view on that.
Or at
So
least laws that don't capture the overall culture. Like,
right.
I didn't know this until studying, but obviously the Catholic Church does not like contraceptives, contraception. The only state that actually had laws against contraception was Connecticut. That was brought
Hmm.
against that was Supreme Court um, case. It was 9-0 that said, you have to be able to at least you can't deny benefits based on contraception. Now that was a 1 versus 49 states. That was a 9-0 that culture in general had already moved on. The law had not really made too much of a fuss about it. But I've just remembered over the study and also in our political talk. So you're big on politics should be downstream from culture. And I think a lot of people in the heterodox political communities that we kind of run in are kind of bemoaning that is now kind of lost. There's more of a federal top-down push instead of a local welling up push for a lot of our laws. And politics should be local, but unfortunately, because of the internet, it's now been nationalized.
So, I mean, I think it's going to be really potentially difficult for, like, I think there is going to be that temptation to be like, wait, I'm a real Christian. Who are all these fakers? And I think it's a period of challenge, but I think it's a period of opportunity. I mean, I feel like one of the things that Christianity can make possible is this idea that, like, we can all agree on some things, but disagree on a lot of other things. And at the same time have effective social relationships, have effective charitable relationships, and have effective spiritual relationships. I mean, you can't be like all of these. I mean, I know there's a lot of different kinds of Protestantism, but like, I mean, ultimately, no church is small enough to make everyone have the same opinion about everything. That's just impossible. So, you're gonna have to accept, like, if you think about like, oh, I can't join this religion because, like, like, think about like, oh, I couldn't possibly be Catholic because JD Vance is a Catholic. I mean, those are the that's what I mean about like the politicization of religion. Like, we're gonna have to dump that whole train of thought because it just shows you like immediately how narrow-minded and silly it is. Because it's like you don't know what it's like to be in someone else's brain when they're like at worship. Like, there's this fundamental unknowability that the ritual of, communal worship is supposed to basically say, trust what we're all doing with our bodies and with our butts in the seats here. Trust that. And that, I think, is a really, I don't, I think I used to feel like, for me personally, it really was like, I believed that that kind of trust and fellowship existed in, like, whether it was academia or maybe just in liberal politics. And it's not in either of those places. Believe me, I'm old enough now to say that I looked. And so for me, Christianity, just because it's the mainstream religion here, it's the religion that formed the West. I mean, it's carried a certain amount of Judaism over with it, which is great because it does make it more familiar to me. But it's like, you got to go, if you're looking for that thing and you haven't found it where you've looked, you got to go look in the other place. And that for me is really where I'm at in terms of my own journey. And I think, yeah, I think there is really it's interesting because I wonder if, like, yeah, it is interesting the way that Mark presents, because you know how Jesus goes and collects the original disciples who become the apostles, and it's like, did they know there was something missing? I'm not sure they did, but maybe they did on a bigger sense, because when he said follow, they just said okay.
Well, follow, Jess. I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you so much for joining Church Coffee today, and perhaps we'll have you back after we finish The Chosen, or I've already outlined a study of John, so then we'll have you back after that.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Rob.
You're welcome. Everyone, see you next week.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.